U.S. History, Chapter 11. The Great Depression begins. We're going to start out first looking at the Great Crash, or the stock market crash of 1929. But first, before we start looking at the Great Depression, let's clear away some definitions. The first thing that you probably need to understand is what is a depression. And what a depression is nothing more than a severe, prolonged recession. Now you may wonder, okay, well, what exactly is a recession? A recession, technically, the technical definition for a recession is a period of negative economic growth for 2 consecutive quarters, a quarter being 3 months of a year. So if you've had basically a 6-month period where the economy has, where our total output, in other words, the total value of all goods and services has gone down for 2 consecutive months, we call that a recession. A depression is a severe recession that is prolonged, it's longer. Now when we talk about the Great Depression, the reason why they call it great is because of the severity of the depression and the length of the depression. But like I said, we start with the stock market crash, and the reason why is that although the stock market crash of 1929 didn't cause the depression, it was a contributing factor that made it worse, and it also coincided really with the start of the depression. And so that's typically what we look at. We look for a starting point. When did the Great Depression start? It started with the stock market collapse of 1929. So our learning objectives for this first section, we will explain the economic factors and conditions that made the American economy appear prosperous during the 1920s. We'll identify basic economic weaknesses in the American economy in the late 1920s and describe the effects of the crash on the economy of the United States and the world. The 1920s was a period where we had a strong economy overall. While there were some elements of the American economy that were struggling, overall the economy performed well. Between 1922 and 1928, the U.S. Gross National Product, or GNP, which is the total value of all goods and services, rose 40%. Though farmers and some other workers didn't benefit, the overall economy performed well, especially for automakers and those who made auto parts. Overall, unemployment remained low, averaging around 5% between 1923 and 1929. Now, another thing you need to understand when it comes to unemployment, what the United States considers to be full employment is anything below 5%. And the reason why is there's always some people that are unemployed temporarily. Now, at any given point in time, you're going to have some people that are in transition. Maybe they just moved. Maybe their spouse had to move across the country and they moved with them and they haven't had a chance to find a new job. Or maybe they moved to be closer to family and they have to look for a new job. Maybe they got laid off from one job because some new technology has put them out of work and they're in the process of acquiring new skills to find another job. Maybe any one of a number of things. Maybe it's a seasonal job. They got laid off because it's the end of the season, but they'll be going back to work soon. These types of things. You're always going to have some people that are briefly in transition, and so because of that, they don't consider full employment to mean that everybody that's actively looking for a job has one. But at 5%, jobs are pretty easy to find. If you've got the proper skills, you should be able to find a job. And so, really, we pretty much had full employment during the 1920s. Union membership slowed as well during the 1920s because this was the point in time, like we talked about in the last chapter, when American companies were engaging in welfare capitalism. And so people were doing pretty well. People didn't see much need to join a union because overall their wages were high. They felt their employer was taking good care of them. this feeling of prosperity encouraged workers to buy new products and to enjoy leisure activities such as movies. So, overall, people felt that things were pretty prosperous. People felt good about the economy. People felt good about the way that things were going. And there was a strong stock market during the 1920s. The stock market, where people buy stocks or shares in companies, performed very well in the 1920s, with stock values sharply increasing each month. The value of stocks traded quadrupled over 9 years. The steep rise in stock prices made people think that the market would never drop, and now more ordinary Americans bought stocks than ever before. The number of shares traded rose from 318 million in 1920 to over 1 billion in 1929. That's more than 300% increase in the number of stocks traded. Business leaders said everyone could get rich from stocks. People had high hopes. Faith in business and government were high. Many Americans thought that the prosperity of the 1920s proved the triumph of American business, and public confidence in government was high. Presidents Harding and Coolidge both favored policies that helped businesses, and both were very popular, easily winning elections. So this brings us now to the 1928 election with Herbert Hoover. When Coolidge didn't run for re-election in 1928, the Republicans easily chose Herbert Hoover. Hoover had been on Harding and Coolidge's cabinets. He had overseen America's food production during the First World War and had an outstanding reputation as a business-like administrator. Hoover's opponent was New York Governor Al Smith, an outgoing politician with a strong Brooklyn accent, whose support came mostly from the cities. Smith was the first Catholic to run for president, and he faced prejudice because of his religion and because of his opposition to prohibition. Now, in terms of the opposition to his religion and the prejudice, remember, this is in the period still of the 1920s. This is still during that period when we saw a resurgence of the KKK. And the KKK was no longer just targeting African Americans, but now they were targeting anybody who wasn't a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And so Catholics, non-Protestant Christians, they were targeted. Also, many Americans were fearful of electing a Catholic to the presidency because the Pope, who's not elected and usually is not American, is the head of the Catholic Church. People felt that that would jeopardize our national security, because what if the president unquestionably takes advice from the Pope? So, people were a little nervous about putting a Catholic in there. And so, that contributed to Smith not having a very good showing in the 1928 campaign. Hoover easily won the election, but the race clearly demonstrated the conflicts that were dividing the nation in that era. And once again, think about where Smith's support came from. Smith's support came from the big cities. Well, this is during the period when we first began to see a real shift in values. This is the era where we began to see a rift develop between the rural areas and the cities. For the first time, you had this situation where the country's really divided. Rural areas are becoming very conservative, and the cities are much more progressive, more of a liberal agenda. Democrats in general enjoyed much greater strength in the cities, and Republicans enjoyed support more from rural areas. And that was reflected in this election. Now, let's look at the economic weaknesses that existed in the 1920s. So, on the surface, everything appeared prosperous because a lot of things were going well, but there were problems. While many Americans enjoyed good fortune in the 1920s, many serious problems bubbled underneath the surface. One problem in the American economy was the uneven distribution of wealth during the 1920s. The wealthiest 1% of the population's income grew 75%. In other words, those people that make up the wealthiest 1% of all Americans, their income grew 75%, but the average worker saw less than a 10% increase. Most Americans, any increase in salary was swallowed up by rising prices. Coal miners and farmers were hit hard. But by 1929, over 70% of U.S. families had too low of an income to enjoy a good standard of living. 4 out of every 5 families couldn't save any money during the so-called boom years. Credit allowed Americans to buy expensive goods, but by the end of the decade, many people reached their credit limits and purchases slowed. Warehouses became filled with goods that nobody could afford to buy. And now we'll begin to look more at problems that were specific to the stock market. During this time, because people felt you couldn't go wrong in stocks, many investors were buying on margin, or buying stocks with loans from stockbrokers, intending to pay the brokers back when they sold the stock. So the way that worked is you would only pay a small portion of the cost of the stock, and the rest of it would be bought with a loan. And this worked as long as the market kept going up. When you sold, you'd sell for enough to make sure you covered the loan. But of course, this becomes a very risky proposition, because what if the stock loses value? And as the market rose, brokers required less margin. In other words, they didn't require as much of the investor's money. They began to loan out a larger portion. If stocks fell, brokers could ask for their loans back. That was called issuing a margin call. And so, once a stock began to drop in price, someone that could bought on margin, they could be asked to pay back that price. And of course, then they would be forced to sell immediately. Now, we're going to look at the actions taken by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is the nation's central bank, and the board of the Federal Reserve was worried about the nation's interest in stock, and they decided to make it harder for brokers to offer margin loans to investors. Their move was successful at first until money came from a new source. Many businesses, many American corporations were willing to give money to brokers, so that they would have money for the loans, and the buying continued to rise. The stock market crashes. The steady growth of the early 1920s gave way to outstanding gains at the end of the decade until its September 3rd, 1929 peak. So that was the high point of the stock market. It was at its highest point, at the top. It peaked on that date. But many people by this point in time are starting to see trouble as consumer purchasing fell and rumors of a collapse circulated. Now, this isn't unlike what we recently have experienced with the so-called Great Recession, the worst economic period since the Great Depression. That started with housing prices. There was a housing bubble. Housing prices were overinflated, and people started thinking you couldn't go wrong in terms of buying housing. But the market turned. The bottom fell out of the market, and the so-called bubble burst. And that's really what happened with the stock market. People felt you couldn't go wrong, so people made riskier and riskier loans. And that's ultimately what happens. Eventually, those overinflated stock prices have to take a hit, especially because there were problems with the economy. Like I said, people had bought on credit. When they could no longer buy on credit, purchasing slowed. Warehouses started becoming filled. So a lot of those stocks were really artificially too high. They really shouldn't have been as high as they were because the companies weren't in good shape, but people felt you couldn't go wrong, so they kept investing. But as people start worrying, then people start deciding maybe it's a time to sell their stocks. The idea when people are trying to buy stocks, a lot of people try to play the market. They call that speculation. They're trying to buy when the stock prices are low and sell when it's high. And so, because a lot of investors are kind of trying to play this game and trying to time it, and they keep seeing the stock prices go up, they've been feeling really good about it, but when the stock prices, they start getting nervous, the stock prices are going to fall, people decide to sell. And what they can create is what you call a self-fulfilling prophecy. The thing they're worried about happening, they cause. And so what happens here, people are worried that the stock prices are going to crash, and so people start selling. When people see people selling, people become nervous, they want to sell. And that starts driving the prices down. And it can create a panic, and that's exactly what happened in October of 1929. On Thursday, October 24th, some nervous investors began selling their stocks, and then others followed, creating a huge sell-off with no buyers. So, and once again, that it comes into the forces of supply and demand. If there really aren't people waiting to buy these stocks, and all of a sudden people are trying to get rid of them, the stock prices start to plummet. And that's exactly what was going on. And so as the stock prices plunged, that triggered an even greater panic to sell, because people began to see the stock prices were dropping, and then they started panicking. So they started selling, and that caused the stock prices to fall even more. It starts becoming a vicious cycle. Toward the end of the day, leading bankers joined together to buy up stocks and prevent a further collapse, which stopped the panic through Friday. And then the markets closed over the weekend, so that gives them a little bit of a reprieve. And of course, they're kind of hoping when the market reopens on Monday, things will pick back up. But the next Monday, the market sank again. And then on Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, it was the worst day, affecting the stocks of even solid companies. The damage was widespread and catastrophic. In a few short days, the market had dropped in value by about $16 billion, which was more than, or nearly, 1/2 of its pre-crash value. Look at the effects of the crash, the impact it had on individuals. Though some thought that the market would rally, countless individual investors were ruined. Margin buyers were hit the hardest because the brokers demanded that they pay back the money that had been loaned. To repay the loans, investors were forced to sell the stocks for far less than they had paid, and some lost their entire savings trying to make up the difference. In the end, many investors owed enormous amounts of money to their brokers, with no stocks or money left to pay their debts. The effect on banks. The crash triggered a banking crisis, causing bank runs, as frightened depositors rushed to withdraw their money, draining the bank of funds. Now, to understand this, you need to understand how banks operate. Banks operate on what we call a fractional reserve system. Now, what that means is that when you go and you deposit your money in the bank doesn't necessarily keep your money. You may have it on account, and you might be able to go and withdraw your money anytime you want, but the reality is what banks do is they take a small fraction of all of their deposits and they keep them. They loan out the rest, and that's how they make their money. They can either loan it out or invest it. And so, because of that, if everybody that has their money in the bank goes to withdraw their money all at the same time, banks have a problem. They don't have enough money to cover it because a lot of it's already loaned out. And this is what happened because people began to panic, fearing that their bank might collapse and they might lose their money, so they went to withdraw their money, which was probably a smart thing. I mean, after all, if you think the bank is going to collapse, you don't want to wait until the money's gone. However, everybody coming to withdraw their money caused the collapse because the bank literally had to close their doors because they couldn't give the depositors their money back. Many banks themselves had also invested directly in the stock market, and many others had lent money to the brokers for the margin loans. And then when investors couldn't repay the margins, the banks lost money too. And these failures drove many banks out of business. Now looking at the impact on business. The crash crushed businesses because banks couldn't lend money. For example, if you had a business and you wanted to expand and you needed to borrow, you couldn't do it because the money wasn't available. Banks couldn't afford to make these loans. Consumers also cut back their spending on everything but essentials. And companies were forced to lay off workers when demand decreased. Unemployed workers had even less money to make purchases, and then the cycle continued. It just becomes a vicious cycle. Businesses lay people off because they're not selling as much. They don't need the workers. The workers that have lost their jobs aren't able to buy as much, so the economy slows down even further, causing more businesses to lay workers off, causing less people to be able to buy products, and demand slows even more, and more people get laid off. It just becomes a vicious cycle, getting worse and worse and worse, in a spiral. In the year after the crash, American wages dropped $4 billion, and nearly 3 million people lost their jobs. Now look at the impact on Europe. The United States doesn't exist in isolation. We do business with other countries. We trade with other countries. So if something has a huge economic impact on us, it's going to ultimately impact other countries as well. And that's exactly what happens with the Great Depression. The fragile economies of Europe were still recovering from World War I, and they had borrowed a great deal of money from American banks that now wanted the money back. That added strain to the European countries. And plus, U.S. buying power was down. With U.S. buying power down, foreign businesses were less able to export their products, and so they were forced to lay off workers. Governments tried to protect themselves by passing high tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods, to make foreign goods more expensive. But that also began to hurt other markets. Everybody's export industries began to suffer. The decline in world trade in the 1930s created misery around the world and contributed to the nation's slide into the Great Depression.